let's get into it and talk about oil. I think you probably now all know that I grew up in Houston. So I've got my Houston Oilers hat on, just to kind of give a sense that, this energy resources, they do impact our culture in some ways. So Houston Oilers, back in the day, that was our NFL football team. So that's the one I grew up with. They became the Tennessee Titans, so that the Houston Oilers no longer exist. But it just kind of as a reminder that they are kind of these energy resources do impact our culture. And of course, just kind of make it a little bit more fun to talk about oil today. So yeah, I grew up in Houston. A lot of our refining in the United States is done along the Gulf Coast. So we have kind of a big infrastructure for bringing oil into there, refining that into the products we want, and delivering those to markets. And so that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. We do refine locally as well. So here we used to go on one of our field trips to the Valero refinery. This is up in Benicia. This is in the North Bay. That's where quite a few of our Northern California refineries are. And then we have kind of a separate group in Southern California. We no longer do this tour, and actually the Benicia refinery is shutting down right now. So maybe you've seen that in the news. It's closing as of this month. So another thing we're going to talk about is refining is actually a low margin, high volume business. So what that means is they can only make money if they're making a lot of product. They can't ramp down and make half of what they're making or something and still make money. It's low margins on each gallon of fuel that they're making, but if they do it at volume, they can make money. What we're seeing in California is a decline in the gasoline markets. And so as we've seen a decline in demand, we're seeing refineries switch or shut down. It's going to be a little bit step change, and so this could really impact gasoline prices in the state as we see these changes playing out. So we'll talk more about that. So just kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about today. We like to have framing questions. These you can kind of revisit as you're thinking about oil, but we're going to answer a lot of these. Thinking about foreign policy, how do we move oil around the world? What are some of the impacts in terms of different ways that we produce oil? Why we have different fuels in different areas, gasoline, diesel, things like that. And then, refineries, fence line communities, closing of refineries. What is kind of the responsibility there in terms of cleaning those things up? You've seen this before. So we've already kind of gone through exploration and how we get land rights and mineral rights, how we drill for it, how we complete wells, whether they're conventional or unconventional, it's a little different, right? So how we're getting it out of the ground that's producing, and today we're really going to be at the tail end, but we're also going to do some big picture. So in honor of this, I've got that's right, we start with our drilling rig, and we go all the way to producing, and today we're going to be talking about refining and things like that. So what we're going to talk about today is that oil is not all the same. We talk about oil, we talk about a global price of oil. It is not the same everywhere in terms of what we're getting out. So we're going to talk about the different characteristics and how we characterize it. Some of the terminology, oil, petroleum, what does it mean? We'll talk about that. So you have the nomenclature of what oil is. It is this global commodity. We move it around. This is why we have these global benchmark prices. So we move quite a bit of it around. It used to be even more, but now that the US is a major producer and consumer, actually less of the overall oil that's being produced is being moved around because we're using that domestically. We're going to talk about markets and how dependent our transportation system is on oil, so it makes it very hard to use something else. We can't just swap it out. We need oil to run our transportation system. So that really can impact our economies. We're going to talk about how we transport it in different cases. What are the products that we make it into? And then a lot of the environmental impacts, both thinking about legacy ones, which we've already covered some of this. We've heard about the oil wells and the upfront stuff, but closed refineries also are a big legacy concern with our oil infrastructure. So half of our energy-related Superfund sites in the US are actually closed refineries. And then, kind of ongoing environmental impacts. We've talked about some of these, like venting or flaring of natural gas, methane emissions, things like that. But of course, all of our products are also big air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So the gasoline, the diesel, the jet fuel that we're using. And so we're going to talk more about that. So that's kind of the map of what we're going to go through today. So let's start with where we're at. You guys have seen these before in terms of our pie charts. So you can see oil is our #1 resource in the world and in the US. Although natural gas is quickly catching up to oil in the US, but globally you can see oil is very dominant in terms of our energy system, and it's almost non-existent in our electricity system. So this is one place that when you're listening carefully to media, I was even listening to, I think they were talking about it on Marketplace the other day. They were talking about nuclear energy and, you know, how does the oil price impact nuclear energy? And it doesn't. It's not a competitor. These are different markets. So something I want you to really take away from is that when we're talking about solar and wind and, you know, these things, coal, the oil is in a different market. It's really for transportation and some industrial uses. It's not used in our electricity system. And so, you know, this gets confused a lot in the media in terms of thinking about oil. We largely got off oil in our electricity system in the 70s when we had the Arab oil embargo and the shortage, when we actually had shortage of oil. We were like, why are we using oil for electricity? We can use all these other things for electricity. Let's just use it for transportation. There are a few exceptions. So there's a little bit, right, where we use real oil in the electricity system. Anybody know where that might be? Backup generators for sure. So like diesel generators, hospitals, you know, where you want that reliability. Places in India where, you know, if you can afford it, there's a lot of backup diesel generators in order to maintain reliability on the grid. The other big place is islands. So island nations or island states, Hawaii actually has some oil electricity generation. That's in this tiny little, it's actually like 0.1% here. Because if they don't have enough domestic, oil is something that they can transport to an island and use that for electricity generation. Tends to be very expensive electricity, but it is electricity that, you know, that a lot of the islands, nations and states still rely on. All right, so just to drive home the point, this is looking at the oil kind of like Sankey diagram or the energy system in the US. And so this is all the way from our supply to what we use it for, which is transportation fuels, and then some for industrial, but some of that is even for making transportation fuels. So really think transportation when you think oil. One of the things we've already kind of mentioned in the first lecture, so reminding you, going back to that, we used to import 2/3 of our oil in the US, and that's gone down, so it's about 1/3 of what we would consider oil supply. But we also export crude oil, which is something that for a long time wasn't allowed in the US. It was part of a deal actually about a decade ago in 2015, where the Democratic Party wanted to re-up subsidies for renewable energy, solar and wind. And the deal they made with the Republican Party was to allow exports of oil. Before that, we hadn't allowed it because of energy security reasons. The idea was that if we had oil, we wanted to keep it for ourselves. But as with the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing revolution, we had a lot more production. And we're going to talk about today, our refining capacity isn't really set up to refine the type of oil that we produce here. We have to mix it with some other oils in order for our refining capacity to be optimized. Okay. So we export crude oil, we export refined products as well. These tend to be to our neighbors, so we have a lot of refining capacity, and so if we're making gasoline and diesel, we might sell some of that in Mexico and in Canada, things like that. And then this big wedge kind of has grown a lot with the horizontal drilling hydraulic fracturing revolution as well. These are our natural gas liquids. So we don't consider them a crude oil production, but these are domestically produced natural gas liquids, which are the between natural gas and oil. And those can go into our processing to make our fuels as well. And so this is also a big wedge that's being done domestically. You guys have seen something like this before in terms of our energy system where, we're going from our extraction all the way to our use. And I wanted to just remind you of kind of the efficiency. We're pretty efficient at a lot of this in terms of the extraction, how much energy it takes, the transportation, even the refining, which takes a lot of energy. But remember, in our cars, we're using a heat engine. And here's where you're doing really the energy conversion, where you're converting it from that chemical energy into heat in order to make mechanical energy in order to move our cars around. And so our heat engines, anywhere from 15 to 20% efficient here in terms of moving us around. And so that is where a lot of our losses happen in this energy system. We've talked about this and we'll talk about it more. This is one of the big benefits of electrification, is really improving the efficiency of getting those end services. So just to remind you of a few things, you've already seen this, but we only have 3% of the world's proved oil reserves. Much of that is in Texas. North Dakota really came on the scene with horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and New Mexico, which shares kind of the same basin as Texas. So that's where a lot of our reserves are. Much of the world's proved oil reserves are in OPEC. So Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They get together and work together to come up with production quotas to impact the market. Now that can be either to drive prices up. It can also sometimes they increase production to drive prices down to push out competitors. So there was a time where the horizontal drilling hydraulic fracturing was a little more expensive. And so they upped production and it drove out a lot of the startup companies that were trying to do that because it dropped the price of oil. So they work together. Here's just kind of a map of who they are. 12 member countries with a few countries that occasionally work with them. So places like Russia, they sometimes work with the OPEC countries to think about production quotas and impacting markets. Big one, Venezuela as one of the organization, the OPEC countries has the largest reserves in the world, but we're going to talk about how Venezuela's oil is very different from Saudi Arabia's oil. So this oil is what we're talking about is like heavy and sour. This is very light and sweet. Our refineries here are set up more for this type of oil than this type of oil, which is what we're getting out of the middle of the US too, is more of this sweet stuff. So it does matter in terms of what your refineries are set up for. And we'll talk about why. So I just wanted to introduce some terminology to you too, because we have oil exporting countries. You also may have heard the term petrostates. You may have heard the term resource curse. This is just the idea that if your economy is very dependent on oil exports in terms of revenue and trade for your country, and that's the main thing, or maybe even the only thing, there are some risks associated with that. We've seen, in the last, I would say even last decade, places like Saudi Arabia has really tried to diversify their portfolio funds so they're not just dependent on oil exports for their economy because there are some risks. So there's a lot of challenges with this setup. Sometimes in some countries it ends up being a royal elite or government elite that benefits from the oil. Remember, the mineral rights are often owned by the government. The only place we have private mineral rights are in the US. And so it can lead to a lot of distortion in some of the economies. Let's talk about who's producing it and who's consuming it. All right, so here I've got world oil production in terms of different countries. So you can see the US is the largest producer of oil and the largest producer of oil ever of any country. So we're really at a high point in terms of production of 2025. And so you can see OPEC share of production and then OECD, which is kind of like Western countries. I've kind of given you a sense of that here. Each about a third. This used to be much smaller, and you can get a sense that OPEC had a bigger impact on the market when they had a bigger share of the production. But with US production growing, they have less impact, but can still be very impactful, as we're seeing today. And then on the consumption side, US has long been about a fifth of the world's oil consumption. China has grown a lot. So if you looked at this over time, you would see China's consumption really growing with its economic growth. But you can see in terms of OPEC, not a lot of consumption, right? There really are oil exporting countries, not a lot of consumption domestically. A lot of the consumption is a lot of the Western countries. You've seen this before, but just to remind you, here's where our production really took off with horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, where we're now producing more than any other country ever. Looking at those same things, so we look at the pie charts, so let's look at them over time. So you can see that oil production and consumption have really grown over the last 50 years with that growth in North America. And then, of course, Asia really having that growth in demand. So we're finding more oil, we're producing more oil as our oil demand has gone up. I want to give a big picture in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and some of the impacts. We're talking about the significance of oil in the world. So this is just the subset of greenhouse gas emissions that are energy related. And you can see that oil is a big wedge. That's not surprising, right? Oil is that number one energy resource. Coal is a bigger wedge because it's less efficient. It's more carbon intensive. So providing less of our energy need, but very carbon intensive. You can see oil is still very much a big greenhouse gas emitter. And then, of course, energy is about 3/4 of total greenhouse gas emissions for the world. We talked a lot about methane emissions from different sectors. So oil is a big one, both of the venting and the flaring. So venting is right where we don't have infrastructure for that natural gas. When we're producing oil, we produce associated gas. We don't have anywhere to put it. We can vent it or flare it. Even flaring is pretty inefficient. It doesn't convert all that methane to CO2, especially if it's windy or anything else that's disrupting that flame. So you still get a lot of methane emissions straight out, even if you're flaring. So that's where a lot of this methane emission is coming from. Our oil system is in places where we're not capturing that natural gas. Finally, before we go to the next section, I just wanted to mention that the fossil fuel industry, especially the oil and gas industry, has been targeted. Sorry, there's a lot of words on this slide. You guys can read it later. In the court systems, basically for they're being accused of misleading the public on climate change. And so California is one of the places that is suing the oil industry for this. I think this was just an article done with Columbia Law School that basically says it's going to be a tough road to have this go through the court systems and for these lawsuits to win out. A lot of that is because the oil industry was providing, a product that all of us were demanding that was a key part of our economy. But they are trying to use the argument kind of like the tobacco industry and cigarettes, where it's like they were misleading the public on how impactful it was in terms of climate change. And that's kind of the basis of the lawsuit and the harms related to using these fuels. So you can see this was filed in 2023. Court systems tend to be pretty slow, but if you're interested, you can check out kind of where the latest is on that. Any questions so far?
Based on the production versus consumption numbers of this slide, are we worried about running out of oil?
That's a great question. So thank you for bringing that up. And there's more in the notes on this slide that talks about that. The difference between this, there's a few things that lead to the difference between this and this. Some of these consumption numbers include things that aren't oil. So any additives we put in our fuels, like here in the US, we add ethanol, and they don't bother to subtract that out. They just say that's our gasoline consumption. It's 10% ethanol. So some of those things are included in our consumption numbers. There's also, this is for a snapshot for a year. So there's storage that's a little bit, part of that buffer, that difference between consumption and production. And the other thing is these are in volume, right? A barrel is a volume. And our products actually take up more volume than the crude oil. And so it's like 42 gallons of crude oil going in creates 45 gallons of product. And so that's also part of the difference that you see here. To your question about are we worried about running out, I would say no. I think we know where a lot of resources are. If prices are favorable enough, we know how to invest and get them out. I would worry much more about the damage of using up all of our oil than worry about us running out of oil, if that makes sense. Yeah, so transitions are happening because of the harms, not because we're having a shortage of oil. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what is oil and stuff. So just to remind you, they're not underground pools of oil, right? They exist in teensy tiny pore spaces in rocks, whether that's a conventional or unconventional oil. So that's what that looks like. You guys have seen this before. It's in the middle, right? It's kind of these long chains, C5 to C40. It's liquid at ambient temperatures. But there's a lot of differences in it too. So what I'm showing you here is the density. We call that API gravity. This is a system that was developed by the American Petroleum Institute in terms of it, whether it's heavy or light. So these heavy ones are low numbers, these light are high numbers, and you can see the range in terms of what API gravity it has in terms of these different locations of crude oil coming out of the ground. So crude oil is the stuff that we're producing. It's coming out of the ground. We use North Sea Brent or West Texas Intermediate. You can see they're relatively light crudes. Those are like our benchmark crudes. So when you think about price, these are the two that are being referenced as the global price. But all of these would actually fetch different prices on the market based on where they are, how far you have to get them to where you're going to use it, and how heavy or light it is, and how much sulfur it has in it. So the other characteristic we really rate it by is whether it's sweet, that means it doesn't have a lot of sulfur, or it's sour and it has a lot of sulfur. What sulfur means is you have to do more to it in order to make it into a low sulfur fuel, which is pretty much what's demanded in almost every market now, because sulfur is a bad air pollutant. So the high sulfur fuels are going to be cheaper or crude oils are going to be cheaper than the ones that are sweet, because you have to do more in order to process that sulfur out. Okay, so let's look at some oil. Okay, let's start here. Okay, so this is California oil. California oil is not the best oil. Okay, so it's super heavy. This is from Stanford. It's one of the places we go on a field trip. It's a super heavy oil, and you can see that it comes out with a lot of produced water. So this is ancient water that just exists with the oil down in the reservoir. And so we like to joke that Stanford is not an oil production location. It's actually like a water treatment plant, because they have to separate out the oil from this produced water, and then they either re-inject it into a wastewater well, or on half of the field, they actually do reverse osmosis, clean up the water and put it into the river. Okay, so you have to do something with this water. It is very heavy, so it's on this end, right? Very heavy oil. You have to do a lot of processing in order to make it into the gasoline or diesel or jet fuels that we want. This is what Stanford oil, this is heavy oil. So think this is like Venezuelan oil. Okay, so very heavy oil. This is after they've removed the water from it. So this has been processed. Don't shake it all the way, because otherwise it'll just look black. It takes a long time for this to drain back down into the bottom. So just kind of move it a little bit, and you can see what the processed Stanford oil looks like. Okay, big proud state of Texas. This is what comes out of the ground in Texas, New Mexico. This is what comes out of the ground in Saudi Arabia. This is very light. This is very close to gasoline. So it's already almost there. It doesn't take as much refining to get this into the products we want. So this fetches a higher price. So think of this is like West Texas Intermediate that we're basing our global, when we talk about oil price on. Okay, so you can see this one, you can just shake around. Again, don't open it. You can really see the difference in our crude oil. Before we get into talking about refining, transporting and refining our crude oils, I do want to just take a moment, because we didn't get to cover this earlier, to talk about Canadian oil. So Canadian oil is what we call oil sands or tar sands. This is in Alberta, Canada. It's a very, very heavy oil. I almost think of it as almost a pre-oil. They call it bitumen. Think of it, it's almost more like asphalt. You have to heat it up in order to transport it. You have to heat it up in order to separate it from the sand that it's in. And you have to strip mine it, or most of it is strip mined. So where you're really taking all the overburden off and digging the oil out from the ground in order to get this oil. We've talked about already that U.S. its biggest importer is from Canada. This is what we're importing. And our refineries are set up for that heavy oil. So our refineries were set up for the heavy oil from Venezuela. Then there were sanctions on Venezuela. Now we get a lot of heavy oil from Canada that mixes in with our domestically produced oil in order for it to be kind of the right API gravity for our refineries. So this is kind of the places in Alberta. Like I said, there's two ways to do it, but much of it is done in open pit mining, where they're digging the oil out. There's a lot of controversy with this type of oil production. It is more expensive. So there have been times when the price of a barrel of oil has gone down and this was no longer economic to produce. Sometimes they keep producing it just to kind of ride out those low times. Right now, obviously, it would be very economic to produce it. So to the question earlier, does it drive the transition to alternatives? Maybe, but it also makes extraction from these more energy-intensive ways of producing oil more economic. So we see that with some of the heavy oils. So we worry about the energy it takes. It also takes a lot of water. So you can see that 2 to 5 barrels of water for every barrel of crude oil for this type of oil extraction. And so this is just kind of before and after of one of the strip mines in Alberta. So definitely a very land intensive type of oil extraction. Let's talk about moving our oil around, which we've already touched on some, because how could we not? The Strait of Hormuz is kind of everywhere in the news. So we're going to talk about oil tankers. Also, this is a pretty famous pipeline. The Trans-Alaskan Pipeline brings a lot of the oil that's produced in Alaska down to the lower 48. A lot of the ground in Alaska is actually permafrost or things that go through freeze-melt cycles. So it's really hard to have infrastructure, roads and things like that along it. So a lot of the pipelines are above ground, and they put them far enough above ground, like you can see here, to allow the migration of the caribou through there. So the caribou can migrate under the Transatlantic Pipeline. All right, we've talked about crude oil moving around. So big picture things I want you to take away is we move a lot of crude oil around the world. It's a global commodity, but we don't move our products very far. Oftentimes we're doing the refining and making the gasoline and the jet fuel and diesel closer to where the markets are. And there's differences in terms of how we move those things around. So what this giant chart is showing you, these are the exporters, and this is the importers, and it's showing where they're going. So you can see the big band that goes from Canada to the US, for example, Middle East, going to a lot of different countries and regions in terms of exporting oil. So about half of our oil supply is traded in terms of crude oil, and about a quarter of the products. Okay, so that's just things to keep in mind. These net importing and net exporting regions that I'm showing you here are both products and crude oil. So the other thing to be careful about when you're reading the news is whether they're just talking about crude oil, the stuff that we're getting out of the ground, or they're talking about all oil, which would be the crude oil plus products. And we'll talk about that because the media has been talking about the Strait of Hormuz in a very confusing way when they're talking about crude oil and products, okay? So this is both. So these net exporting regions, this is both crude oil and products, and the net importing regions, that's both crude oil and products. We move our crude oil around a lot by tanker. So over water. So you can see over 2/3 of crude oil and petroleum products are being moved around by water, but a lot of our crude oil exports. So when we're moving crude oil between countries, a lot of times that is by water. So of our exports, think that we're moving it by tanker in terms of crude oil, with notable exceptions, like we get a lot of our Canadian oil from via pipeline. And you can just kind of get the sense that we're moving those around far. There are both international and domestic agencies that govern the ships that are being used to transport oil. On the international level, MARPOL is the big one. This is an international consortium that is really trying to regulate the tankers on international waters, both from an air pollution standpoint and safety standpoint, auditing, things like that. Okay. Shadow fleets that we talk about with like Russia and things like that. One of the big risks is they're not insured, they're not audited. There are a lot of concerns about the safety, the upkeep of those kind of ships because they are not part of kind of the global fleet that's regulated. And then, of course, locally, this is just kind of the US. We have air pollution regulations on the ships once they come into domestic waters, into the ports. Sometimes they even have to switch fuels. The tanker out in the international waters will use something called bunker fuel, which is very close to that heavy fuel. It's kind of like a very carbon intensive, very heavy fuel. They might have to switch to diesel when they come into port in order to lower the air pollution as they're getting closer to shore. And then more and more, even in the US, some of our ports, like in California, are requiring them to turn off their diesel and plug into the grid when they're at port to lower those air pollution impacts locally. So there's a lot of things going on in terms of the air pollution. Oil tankers that we move things around in, they're kind of classified as, we call them dirty or clean, but it doesn't have to do with whether it's dirty or clean. Dirty just means it's crude oil. So we have crude oil tankers, and then we have clean tankers that would be products. It's just a way of classifying whether it's used for one or the other. It's used for one or the other. We don't use them interchangeably in terms of like crude oil and products. They're built a little bit differently. Crude oil ones tend to be our big ones because we're moving them really long distances over the ocean. So they tend to be the bigger ones. And our refined products tend to be smaller, although there's some variation because it depends on where you want your crude oil to go through. Some of these tankers are too big to go through some of the choke points. So we have things called the Suezmax or the Aframax or the Neopanamax. So there's tankers that are designed to go through certain canals that other tankers wouldn't be able to go through. Importantly, Strait of Hormuz can accommodate our largest tankers. So it is one of the places that isn't limited in terms of size of tankers in order for it to go through. Whereas like Panama, Suez, they have some limitations in tanker size. I want to give you a sense of the scale of these tankers. So I told you I grew up in Houston. We had a little boat. Sometimes we'd go out on the boat and go look at the Houston ship channel, and the ships would be coming in and the dolphins would be riding the waves on the bow waves on the ships, which was kind of fun. They are enormous. So this, I think, is still the largest one built, but you can see it's about the size of the Sears Tower or Empire State Building. These are very big ships. So these ones, these really big crude ships, very big. You will see, and you'll be able to tell whether they're full or empty based on how high they're riding in the water. But they don't ride very well if they're not full, so they'll add water to tanks that they have to let them ride a little bit lower, even if they don't have product in them. So just fun things about our tankers. Okay, where do they go? This is just one diagram looking at the shipping routes and how long it takes. And I like this one because it kind of shows you the alternatives if there is a shutdown in a choke point. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll talk about that more, but the Suez Canal has had, in the last few years, some shutdowns as well, both from Houthi rebels from Yemen shut down the Suez Canal for a while. Sometimes there's been accidents that close it off. If the Suez Canal is closed off, you can see that there are alternative routes in order to go around Africa, which takes a lot longer, but it does allow trade to continue for a lot of shipments. The difference in the Strait of Hormuz, that's right up there, is there's no alternative. There's not like a way around. It's not like you can go another route. So it's particularly challenging because there isn't like, for those countries that surround it, there isn't like pipeline infrastructure that's capable of moving that crude oil to like the other side so they could export it. So that's really what we're seeing right now, and it's the largest disruption in oil supply in history, both from a percentage standpoint and from a volume standpoint. And this gives you that sense. So this is showing you from first quarter of 2025, what were the daily transit volumes of petroleum and other liquids. So this is both oil and petroleum products in these places. And you can see the Strait of Hormuz really stands out in terms of the importance on oil movement. I made that point that it is crude oil and products. So if you actually look down at the detail, a lot of what was transmitting the strait is crude oil, but it's also some products. So when you see those quotes in the news media that it says it's 20% of oil supply, they're kind of adding these two together and then saying it's part of oil supply. So it's to give you a sense of scale, not to tell you that it's 20% of crude oil. Okay, so just something to think about when you're reading it. But like I said, this is the largest disruption. Because there aren't alternatives, you can see it's kind of a narrow point here through the strait. It's right next to Iran's border. And there isn't a lot of pipeline infrastructure in order to export that oil in other ways. So you remember that we get most of our oil from Canada. So just reminding you about that. We are a net exporter of crude oil plus products from the US. So you kind of have to combine that up. We've been that since 2020 as we're using more oil domestically. So again, for us, for the United States, we're not having really a shortage of oil. We didn't get a lot of oil from the Strait of Hormuz. We got it from a lot of other countries. And then we have so much domestically, but it is a global price. And so just having that supply doesn't insulate you from the price of oil because it is a global commodity. And so it's an opportunity cost that we're using it here and somebody else can't. So we've seen prices skyrocket since the US-Israeli attack on Iran. And then they kind of skyrocketed again because the peace talks didn't work out this weekend. So both WTI and Brent, remember those are our benchmark crudes globally. Okay, but it's not the only thing that impacts oil markets. So let's bring it back to the big picture. The EIA talks about these 7 factors, but it really comes down to supply and demand, right? There's just a lot of things that can disrupt supply, and there's a lot of things that can disrupt demand. So that's what we've all been talking about, right? We've been talking about supply disruption causing price to go up, but then that might disrupt demand if we have a recession following that, right? So those are the things that determine the price. Interestingly, the price of oil has not always been volatile like it is now. So what I'm showing you are 2 lines. This is the real price. This is the nominal price. For a long time, the oil price was pretty steady. And it really was the Arab embargo in the 70s that really kind of kicked off this volatility in oil price. And so just zooming in on that time frame, then you can see a lot of different economic, supply, demand factors impact the price of this very global commodity that then impacts our economies and our markets as well. And so you can kind of get a sense of the volatility. So to the earlier comment, we have something called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And this was put in place after that Arab oil embargo in the 70s to try to buffer us from supply shortages. Again, not so much about helping with the price of oil necessarily, but it would buffer us from supply shortages of oil. We store about 35 days of supply. Much of it is in these salt caverns that are on the Gulf Coast. The president has the ability to put oil in or withdraw from this strategic petroleum reserve. But notably, our consumption's around 10 million barrels a day. We can only remove about 4.5 million barrels a day. So it's not like it could supply us for 35 days. It could slowly supply part of us for, 100 days or 150 days. We've drawn oil from it before now about 4 times. 3 of those was in coordination with the IEA. So we are part of a group of countries that said we are going to strategically stockpile oil. So they've all stockpiled oil, and then sometimes we coordinate and withdraw that oil. That happened again just recently, if you're seeing the news. 32 member nations of the IEA said that they're going to coordinate a release from their strategic stockpiles of around 400 million barrels of oil and refined products. So this was about a month ago. And that includes us releasing 172 million barrels from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So this is what the Strategic Petroleum Reserve looks like. We have spare capacity in it. So sometimes we will sell off the oil if the oil price is high. And sometimes we'll buy oil and put into it when the oil price is low. So the US government does have the ability to kind of arbitrage into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But you can see it's not very full. The Biden administration actually sold off some of it. It's not very full at the moment, and then we're going to be drawing from it more because of concerns about supply right now. Any questions on this? Yeah.
What was the rationale for choosing to store such a low volume of oil to continue U.S. operations in the event of something like the 1973 oil embargo?
So it was an international agreement. So I don't know all the insights. It was an international agreement that each of the countries in this consortium of the IEA would stockpile 35 to 40 days of oil supply for their individual countries. I would say it was also not the only thing we did coming out of the Arab oil embargo. So it was part of a portfolio of things. I think the most impactful thing we did was put in place fuel economy standards for our cars. That was hugely impactful in terms of reducing our dependence and our economy's dependence on oil. And so I think this wasn't meant to solve all of it. It was just a piece of a portfolio of approaches to address that. I think what most people don't know is that, okay, we've got 35 days of supply, but we can't draw it out that fast. So that's why it's only 150 days of partial supply. So we have it, but we can't pull it out quickly. Yeah.
Given that most of the U.S. oil reserves are located on the Gulf Coast, are there pipelines to transport the oil if it's needed in other parts of the country?
Yes, we have a lot of pipelines in the U.S. They are concentrated here, and this is where our refining capacity is, so they could draw it into the refineries and then send out products. There's also just the right geology. We have a lot of salt caverns in the Gulf Coast that makes it easy to store these kind of things. But that's a great question, and I'll show you a picture of the pipelines. We have a very vast pipeline infrastructure. Okay, the last thing I really want to say about transportation and tankers. One of the big things that has changed about our tankers is we've had a dramatic reduction in oil spills from our tankers. And so I'm highlighting the Exxon Valdez oil tanker spill in the late 80s because this was really impactful for driving policy to change how we build oil tankers. Okay, so this wasn't one of the biggest oil spills ever, but because of the area that it was in, it was a very biologically sensitive area. So there was a lot of environmental harm from this tanker oil spill. It basically ran aground. There was a lot of concerns about the pilot and what condition he was in. Anyway, so this really drove the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 that required tankers to be double-hulled. And that's what dominates the oil tankers today. Because, for example, if they're going to come to US ports, they have to be double-hulled. And what does that mean? That means there's a space between the hull of the ship and the compartment that's holding the oil. It used to be the hull of the ship was the compartment holding the oil, right? And so if you got any puncture in it, you would have an oil spill. This compartment is also used in useful ways. It's used as a ballast, so they can fill it with seawater. They can help it ride better when the oil tankers are empty, things like that. But that has really led to a dramatic reduction in the oil spills that we see from tankers. So this is showing you over time, smaller spills and big spills in the different colors, but that we've gotten better over time. And a lot of that is because our tankers have continually moved to something like a double hold tanker system. There's also other advancements, right, with GPS and technology and sensors that help with that. But if you imagine where oil tanker spills are going down as the amount of oil that we're transporting has gone up, doubled, tripled, et cetera. So this is kind of a good news story. I would say even so, when it happens locally, it's still very impactful. So we still see a lot of impact if you do have an oil spill. If there is an oil spill on water, you do have a short period of time where the oil is lighter than water, right? Just like you saw in the jar, it will float. So there's things you can do to try to clean it up. You often put booms to try to contain it. You can burn it. You can skim it. You can put biological creatures in there that will help eat it up, basically. You can do dispersion techniques. So we have ways, but it is hard. It's hard to clean up all of the oil when you have an oil spill on water. Let's talk about land and those pipelines we were just talking about. So the cheapest and most efficient way to move oil around on land is pipelines. So if we have pipelines, we're going to use pipelines. That's the best on land. This is showing pipelines here in the U.S. So you can see a lot of those pipelines come down to that Gulf Coast where we have a lot of our refining capacity. They're coming in places in the middle part of the country where we are producing a lot of our oil. You might notice California has a very lack of pipelines. So California cannot import crude oil from the middle part of the country where oil is being produced. And so we either get our oil there's an Alaska pipeline, or we're getting it via ship. And a lot of times it's foreign or it's California oil. You can see what it looks like in terms of how oil is being moved in. This is refinery receipts by mode. For domestic, it's being moved by pipeline. For foreign, it's a mix of pipeline for our neighbors and tankers. Obviously, you can have spills from pipelines too. Those are impactful to the local area. This is just some examples. I'll let you read through those so we can get to refining. For a brief time, we were moving a lot of oil by rail because we didn't have pipeline capacity when we started the horizontal drilling hydraulic fracturing revolution in North Dakota. That was a place we hadn't produced oil before. It ended up being very expensive, and there was a lot of high-profile accidents in moving that. We move very little oil by rail now. We've built out a lot of the pipeline capacity to those locations. Okay, let's talk about refining and how we make our products. And I have another fun thing to pass around. Okay, so these are the oil refineries in the US, but what this chart doesn't show you is how big they are. Some of our largest ones are down here on the Gulf Coast. This is how we take crude oil and make it into the products we want. We can break molecules apart, we can put them back together, we can add hydrogen and stuff in order to make our motor oil or diesel or gasoline. Some of the products go into plastics, things like that. Okay, so how do we do it? It depends a little bit on the refinery, and so there are different stages that we go into. We start with distillation. That's just heating up the crude oil and separating it out by vapor pressures. Okay, so the light stuff will come off the top, the heavy stuff will stay at the bottom. We crack things that are heavy in order to make it into lighter products that we want. So this is where we're breaking some of those molecules apart, making them into shorter molecules. We do some treating where we're trying to get sulfur out. So there's different ways that we can remove sulfur from our fuels. Some of the products are reformed. That's made into different shapes to give it different properties. And then we often blend that together to get our products. So let's go through these a little bit at a time. I've mentioned this already, but this is just a real world example of here's our API gravity, here's our sulfur content. This green box is the operating range for the Valero refinery. The little dots are the crude oil that they buy. So they have to blend things that are outside this box into something that would be within this box in order to run it through their refinery. So, like I said, the Gulf Coast refineries, they were really built for heavy oil, a lot of that coming from Venezuela, now coming from Canada. And so we blend in our domestic production to keep it within whatever the box is for each refinery. Refineries are set up for a certain crude oil mix. Like I said, we bring the crude oil in, we heat it up, we separate it via vapor pressure. This is the simplest refinery you could have. You could literally just have a distillation tower, and it would separate it into the different vapor pressure liquids, and then you can just take those off and use them. So if whatever mix you have that is the right length of chain for gasoline, you could just make that into gasoline. So if you had a really light, sweet crude, this is almost all you would have to do, because most of that would be in that gasoline vapor pressure, and you could make your gasoline products. Much of it isn't. And then, of course, here in the US, we want almost all of it to be gasoline. We're producing gasoline more than any other fuel for the US, and so we're doing a lot more than just distilling it into its different vapor pressures. So I worked for a summer in a refinery, and they would say the heart of the refinery is the catalytic cracker. That is the piece of equipment that is breaking apart those heavier oils into the lighter oils that we want as products. So we're taking that heavy stuff and making it into gasoline, which is one of the main products. There's different ways to do it. You can do thermal cracking, you can do catalytic cracking. Here in the US, a lot of it's catalytic cracking. That's a little lower temperature. We're using catalysts to make sure that happens. We also had a hydrocracker, so some of the heavier stuff would go through a hydrocracker. Again, we're trying to make more gasoline out of those heavier products. We need to remove sulfur. There's 2 locations we do that. The hydrocracker also removes sulfur, and then you also add a hydrotreater, so there are ways of removing the sulfur. That sulfur could then be sold as a product, a lot of times to agriculture or pharmaceuticals. It wasn't, it was like making use of a waste stream. It wasn't a huge cost benefit necessarily, but it was something that they had and they could sell into other markets. All right, and then the reformer, or the alkylation unit. Like I said, these are just kind of changing some of the forms of molecules, and then we can blend those in to get the products we want. In the US, basically almost half of your barrel is going to gasoline because that's our biggest product. So this mix output would look different. Think of distillate, that's like diesel, and then jet fuel. It would look different in a place like Europe, where they use more diesel than gasoline. And I already mentioned this, but it's like magic. You get more volume of products out than you put in. Partly because you're putting them in these lighter fractions, but also because when you're making these lighter fractions from the heavier stuff, you're adding hydrogen to make those lighter fractions. So you have more volume of product than crude oil. I mentioned that this is just looking at the refining capacity and where it is. It's going to be where we have a lot of demand for petroleum products. We refine for our markets. And so you can see North America, we have a lot in Asia Pacific, where there are our major consumers. These are some of the major players for refining. Some of them, like Marathon and Valero, are refining only. And then, of course, some of them, like Exxon, are more vertically integrated. They do refining and upstream. And just to drive home that point, Gulf Coast is where most of our refining capacity is. Now, we've seen some changes in our refineries over time. What we've really seen, and what this is hopefully showing you, is we've seen a reduction in the number of refineries we have, but an increase in the capacity and the total refining capacity as demand has gone up. So if you think about that, that's just like we've shut down the little ones and we've grown and expanded the big ones. And so we have fewer, bigger refineries as that's gone forward. And I already mentioned that those closed refineries can be a major challenge. We don't build refineries, at least not big ones. It is a big capital intensive thing. Again, it's a high volume, low margin business. So the last one that we really built, was in the 70s. There's been some mention in the news that we're going to build a new one down in Texas that's going to be set up to actually refine US shale oil instead of the heavier oils. But even this one is a relatively small refinery, 168,000 barrels a day compared to 600, 500,000 barrels a day.
Is the closing of refineries due to the high volume and low margins?
Absolutely it is. Yes. So these closures are really market driven because you really need that high volume. You're only making pennies on the gallon. You've got to make a lot of gallons in order for it to be profitable. California gasoline. I mentioned that we can't bring in crude oil from other places. We really bring it in from the ocean, and we refine our products here in California. So we have refineries up here in the North Bay, and then we have some refineries down in Southern California that are really taking care of those markets. So we can't really bring it in. So this is what our mix of crude oil supply looks like to California. It used to be very domestic, California and Alaska. California's production has gone down. You saw that we don't have the best oil here. Alaska's production has gone down, and so we've really made up the difference in other places. This is what the pie chart looks like for 2025, but I have to say this pie chart changes a lot. It just kind of depends on where the refineries can get the best deal for the type of crude oil that they want. So it's not like this stays like this. You will see these countries change year to year, depending on what our refineries are buying. Some things you may not know about California is even as we are reducing our gasoline demand in the state, it's one of the biggest gasoline markets in the world. So if we put these in the world, if we took it out of the US, you basically have the rest of the US, you have China, you have Texas, and you have California. Those are the biggest gasoline markets in the world. And so you can see we're going down. So I put 2012 in here and 2023. California's demand is declining in terms of gasoline. And so we're seeing that on the market, and that's why we're seeing these refineries either shift or shut down because we're actually reducing gasoline demand. Now, this is a concern for the state, it's a concern for gasoline prices, and it's a concern for politicians. So you saw Gavin Newsom kind of step in there and be like, wait, don't shut down yet. Because our gasoline demand, although it's predicted to continue to decline, it's not going to decline at the same rate as a refinery shutting down. And so you would temporarily have high prices. So the deal that they made with Valero, who's shutting down this month, is Valero is going to continue to import gasoline to the California market to not have this huge lack of gasoline while we continue to bring that down. And so those kind of deals are happening in the background in order to not have the huge supply shock to California, because it is kind of this isolated market. Refineries have a lot of regulation in the US because there's a lot of impacts. So I've just kind of listed those here. So you can take a look at that. But you think about it, air pollution, solid waste, water, carbon emissions, especially as we have very what we call boutique fuels in California. They're cleaner burning fuels. We do that for our air quality and air pollution reasons, but that means it does take more energy to make those fuels. And so there's a lot of challenges in meeting some of those requirements. And then hopefully you checked out the article that's about fence line communities. Fence line communities are also one of the challenges with any industrial facility, but refineries are in that category. This is where I worked for a summer, was at the ExxonMobil refinery in Baton Rouge. You can see that it's a predominantly Black, very low income neighborhood right around the refinery. And then further from the refinery is where you get more of the wealthier white communities. The refinery was actively trying to buy up this land, but to people that live there, one, either they didn't want to move, or two, they didn't feel like it was at a very good rate for trying to have a buffer between the refinery and the community. Place like Valero, it was here before the communities were built out. So it has that buffer land around the refinery that gives it some buffer between the refinery and the community. But of course, there's still impacts, right? When accidents happen, when oil spills happen, when releases happen, Valero got in a lot of trouble and has had to pay some fines for releasing benzene for a long time that wasn't measured and under the radar, and that impacts the local communities. So we do see a lot of those impacts. I'm going to talk about transportation when I get to the transportation lecture, so I'll leave that to that. I have like one slide on the future of oil, but I think it's better to just talk about it. I think it's hard to predict what's going to happen. We've talked about a lot of the different aspects to it today. What do high prices do? How does that change behavior? What does it do to demand in the global economy? I think I've seen variations of what does the future of oil look like, and I think there's a lot of different things that could impact that. There's been predictions of peak demand at some point in terms of alternatives like electrification and this concern about energy security. But then there's also others that say we have a lot of oil and we can produce it for low cost, and that will allow demand to continue to grow. So as I like to say, I think we try to build the future we want rather than thinking about predicting the future, what the future could be. So just kind of use that frame and thinking about like decisions you make personally and professionally, and what kind of future you would like to see for our planet. And that's it. And we'll talk about coal on Wednesday. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here. If you want to learn more about this topic or other energy topics, visit our Stanford Understand Energy Learning Hub for free resources, including signing up for our monthly Energy Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tap the notification bell to be notified for our newest content.